our ability to work well together on these issues that quite frankly, touch national unity, touch energy and environment, touch relations with all provinces and all regions of this country, is going to be an extremely important thing at a time where we see some very different perspectives across the country that need to be brought together. And I'm very excited about having her as both a strong intergovernmental affairs minister and as my Deputy Prime Minister. I'm very pleased to have given a specific task to Jim Carr to be my special representative for the prairies. He will be able to focus entirely on that relationship, engage with the prairies in a strong and present way, while at the same time sitting on a cabinet committee.
That was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on his cabinet choices and the need for some prairie representation in his inner circle. The relationship between some provinces and this government has been rocky. Carbon pricing and environmental legislation has raised the ire of Canadians, particularly in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So did Prime Minister Justin Trudeau get it right with today's cabinet picks? Let's bring in the Premier's League. In Calgary, the 14th Premier of Alberta from April 2011 to March 2014, Alison Redford. Over in Toronto, Brian Gallant, Premier of New Brunswick from 2014 to 2018. Now Special Advisor to the President of Ryerson on Innovation, Cybersecurity and Law. And in Halifax, the Premier of Nova Scotia from 2009 to 2013, Darrell Dexter, now Vice Chair with Global Public Affairs. Hello to all three of you. Great to see you.
Great to see you.
Hi, Vashi.
Hello, Vashi.
Ms. Redford, I'll start with you because that question about addressing the lack of representation in Alberta and Saskatchewan and the sentiment that underlies it was front and center since the outcome of the election right until today, and the big question was how they were going to address it. What is your assessment of how they did?
Well, I think that people in Western Canada were looking to see some key cabinet positions filled. One was Minister of Energy, of course. Whether the Minister of Environment would change, which it did, and to see Minister Freeland coming in as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, I think gives the Prime Minister an opportunity to now demonstrate what he says is important. It is important for all of these ministries to work together, to work with premiers, to work with stakeholders. This is day one. Now we see what comes next. And if there's some flexibility there and the ability to create a new platform with new people who are prepared to listen to each other, then there might be an opportunity. It's a signal, I think, that things can change. I think things have to change. We talked a lot today about things like regulatory reform, what's going to happen with the existing bills around the regulators. All of that now has to be part of the conversation. It's not all about oil and gas. It's also about the rest of the economy. It's First Nations reconciliation. All of that has to come together. I think the people who are in those portfolios today have been a signal from the Prime Minister that he understands that, but now people have to get to work. And I hope that that will happen very soon, particularly with the climate conference coming up in December.
Mr. Dexter, when you take a look at Cabinet, what sticks out for you?
Well, what struck me was the power of the Montreal-Ottawa-Toronto corridor, with 15 of the 36 ministers coming from that power corridor. I don't think that will be lost either on Atlantic Canada or Western Canada as the cabinet work gets underway. So whatever the priorities of the government are over the next 16, 24 months.
However long it lasts. Yeah.
However long it is. It's going to have to come with a heavy dose of conciliation, looking at where they can find common ground, how they're going to be able to not only hear what is being said in the regions, but demonstrating, clearly that they're hearing and understand that almost 70% of the country actually voted against them.
Mr. Gallant, in that sort of urban representation that Mr. Dexter referred to off the top there, certainly that is where the Liberals saw most of their support in the last election. So it's not, it makes some sense, but to the point that Mr. Dexter was making, it also does sort of send a signal to many of the other parts where there is less representation. What do you think about that?
Well, I agree with that, Vash, and I agree with Alison. And Mr. Dexter, I mean, I think at the end of the day, it wasn't a great day for New Brunswick, if I'm being honest. And I'm biased because I'm her biggest fan, but Jeanette Pitchpa-Taylor not making it to cabinet was certainly unfortunate, I think, for our province.
One of the few cabinet ministers who didn't come back,
Which is unfortunate because she's very, very solid, and I think she did a great job. She's a wonderful MP as well, and just a really good person. Now, to what you just said, Vashi, I can certainly understand why. They I feel, in the middle and the center of this operation, felt that they had to send some signals, and they tried to do that. They're obviously very aware that there may be an election sooner than later. Therefore, they are looking to Central Canada to continue to get their perspective at the forefront and ensure that there's good representation. One thing that I would argue that I would maybe signal as a bit of a piece of advice that I humbly learned while I was in government, there are a few ministers that don't really have line departments, and some that have very important portfolios with regards to the outcomes that will be asked of them. Obviously, the Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Carr as well, who has a very important portfolio, in my opinion, to help with unity. Dominic LeBlanc as well, who, frankly, I think will probably be asked once he's up and going to be a bit of the political operative of government, making sure that everything's going when the Prime Minister might find himself around the country for obvious reasons. So some of those that don't have the line departments but yet will have big outcomes asked of them, they're really going to need their colleagues to step up and make sure that they're there to support them.
Ms. Redford, there is a Premier's Conference coming up in just a few weeks, right a few days prior to the convening of Parliament here on December 5th. The meeting will happen on December 2nd. The Prime Minister has said that he will meet with the Premiers as a group in the new year. Can you talk a little bit about your perception of the kind of, I guess, perhaps united or not, might of premiers in this minority government situation, and how you think they might best use their power?
Well, I think, first of all, that in a federation like ours, premiers are important, and I think prime ministers have to balance those voices very carefully. I do think that prime ministers who have been able to understand and listen and recognize that premiers' voices are important and find a way to include them in the conversation have been more successful in the long run. I think that partly what we'll see at the Council of the Federation meeting, the Premier's meeting, will be a little bit of alignment around some of the messages that we've already heard premiers individually talking about. I would hope that between now and then we'll see cabinet ministers from the federal level reach out to premiers to say, look, we are trying to find ways to reconcile some of these issues and to send some signals so that we might get a different message coming out of the Council of the Federation. But I think that otherwise there's not yet an awful lot that has been signaled just today with the cabinet change that's going to lead to premiers radically changing their position on issues. There's going to have to be some demonstrated decisions at the federal level that will allow premiers some space to think about whether or not there's a different approach and respond. And I actually think one of the issues that may be very important between now and that premiers meeting could be the CN rail strike and how the government decides they want to deal with that, because that tremendously impacts the West and certainly impacts regions.
That's a good point. I am noticing now in my inbox that it says that Minister O'Regan, who takes over the natural resources portfolio, will head to Calgary tomorrow right after Cabinet meets. I think they're meeting around 1 o'clock Eastern. He's already headed to Calgary. He's spoken with the Minister of Energy there, Sonia Savage, as well. Mr. Dexter, your thoughts on, I guess, the relative power of the premiers in this minority situation?
Well, I agree with Alison, but I would also say that if you're going to have a relationship, it actually takes both sides to try and work on that. And I think it would, one of the focus that Alison and I had, and I'm sure Brian had when he was at the COF table, was to try and demonstrate to Canadians that that relationship works, that we work hard to be constructive in the Federation, with the federal government. So I think there is going to have to be some middle ground sought. I think the premiers are going to have to demonstrate that they understand that the federal government does have a mandate. I was heartened to see actually the Premier of New Brunswick after the election simply say, yes. Some of these issues have been resolved. They've been settled by this election. So, I think that's a responsible attitude to take, and to say, we have to be full partners in this federation and make it work.
Premier Higgs, the premier that you're referring to there, Brian, who Mr. Gallant, you know very well, has said, especially on the issue of carbon pricing, and the backstop, that essentially he will bring in something that meets the federal standards given the outcome of the election. Your thoughts, Mr. Gallant, on how the premiers can leverage their position right now?
Well, it's really interesting because there's many things to obviously consider. The unity questions around our country is obviously top of mind. I think that a premier, any political leader that will try to use that in a negative way, meaning trying to stoke that sentiment for any type of political gain or even just for any type of gain whatsoever, would be risking a lot. I'm not sure that's what Canadians want us to see doing. I think that there are people that have real, very legit concerns. Clearly, many provinces, obviously in the West, don't see themselves in the Trudeau government. And I think, as Alison said at the top, there's certainly some signals that the Trudeau government has tried to send today with the cabinet that they've put together, that they're going to try to do what they can. And as you say, Seamus is going to be out there already. That's not for nothing. They're obviously trying to send the right signals. So I do think that there's going to be an opportunity for premiers to step up and take this challenge as an opportunity and really show, as Darryl mentioned, that although we all we represented different provinces and territories when we're in that room, we're all Canadians. We all want to see the whole country advance in the right direction. And I think those that will take that attitude and really try to constructively work with the Trudeau government, not try to capitalize on some of the sentiment that's out there right now when it comes to unity, I think we'll be better off in the long term.
All right, I have to leave it there. I'm out of time, unfortunately. But thank you very much to all of you for your time. And hopefully we can check back in when the premiers meet in early December. Thanks very much to our Premiers League this evening, Alison Redford, Brian Gallant, and Darryl Dexter.
Thanks,
Vashi.
Thank you.
Christia and I have worked very closely on some of the biggest files facing Canada, and our ability to work well together on these issues that quite frankly, touch national unity, touch energy and environment, touch relations with all provinces and all regions of this country, is going to be an extremely important thing at a time where we see some very different perspectives across the country that need to be brought together.
Welcome back to Power in Politics. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau unveiled his new cabinet today in the wake of last month's election, and there are some changes, including a new role for Chrystia Freeland. There are 7 fresh faces, including 2 rookie MPs. 10 ministers are staying put in the new cabinet, and there are some new positions. So what does that all tell us about the government's priorities? David Hurley is a principal partner at the Gandalf Group. He previously served as chief campaign strategist for the Liberals under Paul Martin. Bob Gallagher, right next to him, is on the NDP's federal executive team and a former chief of staff for NDP leader Jack Layton. Both of them are in Toronto. Jeff Norquay is next to me here. He's principal at Earnscliffe Strategy Group, and he's worked in Brian Mulroney's Prime Minister's office and for Stephen Harper when he was leader of the opposition. Hello to all 3 of you. Nice to see you.
Good to be here.
David, nice to see you again, David, I should say. Why don't I start with you? If there's one headline out of this cabinet for you, what is it?
It's the Chrystia Freeland story, and it's not a settled story because we don't know how it's going to work out. They seem to have given her a very large and sprawling mandate that includes some of the things she's been doing in the past, like NAFTA, and then includes basically Canadian economic unity, if you will. She's a tremendously able person. We'll see now how great a communicator she is, because she hasn't really had to carry that much of the ball on communication so far. And that's going to be a key part of this. But she's got, as the Prime Minister said, she's got his trust and confidence. He's given her some major status in the government: Deputy Prime Minister, Chair of the Economic Committee, Vice Chair of the Priorities and Planning Committee, but she doesn't have any policy tools at her disposal. She herself can't make policy that will make a difference, and this will all come down to policy. So this is really going to come down to how much is the Prime Minister prepared to back her up, and how are they going to manage the overlapping responsibilities of Chrystia Freeland, Bill Morneau, industry and innovation. All those things is going to be very confusing.
Bob, what's the headline for you?
Well, I think this is much the same. My sense is that it's a defensive strategy on Justin's part. We have the kind of a minority government that's not going to fall easy for a lot of reasons, but he knows that if there is a scandal or if there is a miscue, it could fall much earlier. And so I think he decided to play it safe, put in people that he believes can be trusted and can communicate, and try to play it defensively to make sure that he actually stays in office for the next 4 years.
Jeff, what do you think?
I want to start by agreeing with David Hurley and what he just said. The Prime Minister, I think, mistook himself for being Minister of Job Sharing, because that's what he's done here. There are 8 or 9, maybe 10 ministers running around with overlapping and interlocking mandates, all with various parts of mandates on the economy. And I think it's going to be really complicated to see how this works. On Minister Freeland, I think it's an important appointment. It remains to be seen what model will evolve of deputy prime ministership. I worked many years ago with Don Mazankowski, who really reinvented the role in a modern sense. He actually played the chief operating officer role as opposed to the Prime Minister Mulroney's CEO role. He managed files, he knocked heads together at cabinet when issues arose. He handled the hot files in the Federation, Newfoundland fish, for example. So it depends on how Minister Freeland interprets the role and how the Prime Minister allows her to interpret the role. And we'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
It's a question of latitude, David, and I think you've brought that up before, right? It's the idea, you seem to have the impression that given her role, for example, in certain committees, that she will have a lot of latitude, and it'd be hard to guess that, it'd be hard to think otherwise given how much latitude she was given, particularly on NAFTA and in dealing with Donald Trump and the US, but I guess it kind of does boil down to that question of latitude.
It does. I mean, the Deputy Prime Minister, Jeff, has just outlined one model, and it's not really a model because it's the only time that's happened.
That's true. That's true, David.
So every other Deputy Prime Minister has been somewhere between totally symbolic or ineffective. And this will depend a lot on how much the Prime Minister is genuinely prepared to delegate to her and how much he's prepared to side with her. If she's going to be going out there and figuring out what the plan is, for example, for a Canadian economy that's inclusive of Alberta and Saskatchewan's interests, then she's going to have to come back and sell that to a government that's not likely to like much of that very much. And it's not going to have come out of the Department of Finance. So there's going to be those kinds of difficulties. I mean, this is not an easy thing to make work. But he's right. They've got a good working relationship. They've made complicated things work in the past. And she's a highly talented person. So I'm prepared to watch and hope. But it's an unwieldy setup.
Bob, what do you think we should take away from how this cabinet might work in a minority government situation as it finds itself?
Well, this minority government, as I mentioned, is actually a pretty safe minority government. So as long as they don't end up with a scandal on their hands, don't end up with something that really screws up, they have an easy go of lasting. However, what they need to do is at the end of that period be able to show that they've actually accomplished something. And my sense is what you need is diplomats in there, and I do think the choice of the House Leader gave us an indication that they actually are going to try to bring diplomats who can work with some of the other parties. But in fact, the policies are much harder than just the diplomacy of getting everybody in the room and feeling good about each other.
It's hard to have diplomacy when it's a knife fight, though, Bob, right?
And that's what, that's what I'm wondering.
Because, I mean, just right on Parliament Hill, the NDP and the Bloc know that the Liberals' path back to majority involves taking seats from them.
Yep, absolutely.
Taking seats from them. And so Liberals are going to be looking for wedge issues that they can hive Quebec voters off from the Bloc and hive progressive voters off from the NDP at the same time that you're supposed to be having these collegial backroom discussions about how to move legislation forward.
Yeah, no, it's true. It will be a knife fight, you know. But the reality is that this Prime Minister has 3 different parties that he can go to on any one issue.
Right.
So he can play one knife against another knife. And so, you know, my sense is that he has an easy time if he can actually work with them. But the fact is that, as you say, you know, everybody's in this to try to bring Justin down.
Jeff, your thoughts on the knife fight?
Well, you know, welcome to the realities of minority government. That being said, tact, diplomacy, sensitivity to others, good interpersonal relationships, the ability to reach and work across party lines, things work better if the cabinet, with the cabinet that is imbued with those principles and acts on them.
Put the knives away.
Yeah,
The other side is true as well.
Even in a majority government, a bad House Leader can get backs up all over the place, and you then end up with stunts in Parliament, playing with the rules, bell ringing, you know, walkouts, arguments at committees. Oh, committees. you
a
know,
lot to look forward to.
Another issue.
Yes. I'm out of time, unfortunately,
Okay.
but we will get into that
Okay.
another time.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. I have to go. I appreciate your time this evening. Thanks to David Hurley, Bob Gallagher, and Jeff Norquay.
I'm very excited today to be able to get down to work the way Canadians asked us to in this last election, to pull together the country, to focus on issues of economic growth for the middle class, to fight climate change, and to keep Canadians and their communities safe. That is our focus, and this is the team to do that.
The table is now set. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has made his cabinet picks. And what do the appointments say about how this minority government plans on moving ahead? Time for the Power Panel to answer that question. Joining us by Skype from Chicago, Danielle Turp, former Bloc MP from 1997 to 2000 and former PQ MNA from 2003 to 2008. Currently, Mr. Turp is president of the Research Institute on Self-Determination and a law professor at the University of Montreal. Welcome to the Power Panel. Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance joins us from Toronto. Over in Fredericton, Summa Strategies' Tim Powers. And here with me in studio, Kathleen Monk of Earnscliffe Strategy Group. And next to her, host of CBC Radio's The House, Chris Hall, is back. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Great to see you. Let's start with Chrystia Freeland. Big kind of headline move here, Kathleen, from Foreign Affairs to Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Intergovernmental Relations. What does that say to you?
Well, and there's a lot of buildup in the days and even weeks leading up to this, that she would even have even more powers, even like some of the economic powers that actually ended up going to Jolie and others. That said, when you actually look at this really, the cabinet committee structure, that's what people like me in my business and Tim and Amanda look at how they're structured. She actually does have a lot of levers of power. She's sitting on what formerly was known as the Priorities and Planning Committee. Now they've renamed it something like the Agenda, Metrics and Communications or Deliverables or something like that. And so she will have leverage. And she also will have leverage because she's sitting on the Economic Committee, which in the past, for instance, under Harper governments, that was something that always the finance minister would sit at, like a Morneau, or in the past,
Right.
Flaherty. So I think it's a significant message. She's also, rumored to be the #1 challenger for leadership within the Liberal Party. So putting her there, is an interesting move by the
Keep your
Trudeau
friends
group.
close, your
Keep
enemies close.
your enemies closer. Exactly. But the Trudeau was, questioned extensively on that by the gallery, time and time again. And he kept on speaking to their relationship and how well they work together.
It's interesting, though, Chris, because he also got a lot of questions. I think one reporter I remember said, what is one concrete thing specifically that she will be able to do in that role? And he kept saying, yes, that we're very close and that she's going to, enjoy a lot of leverage, but he didn't give those concrete.
Yeah, it is. We had a debate in our own newsroom about precisely what her role will be. And I think in large part it is undefined in terms of the specifics. But there's no question that she is there to solve the biggest problems this government faces. The shortage of MPs and representation in the 2 prairie provinces, the lack of representation in many rural parts. She needs to advance the agenda, try to find those areas of commonality or common interest with the provinces, and particularly the members of the so-called resistance, led by Jason Kenney, Scott Moe, Doug Ford. It's going to be a big job. It may be even mission impossible, but clearly, if someone is able to do that, if anyone in this cabinet has negotiating skills, she is apparently the one.
And part of what she is tasked, Amanda, at looking at, or addressing at least, is the lack of representation and some of the sentiment that drove that in Alberta and Saskatchewan. There are a number of other appointments, though, that speak to that. Jim Carr, for example, who we know is ill right now, was also appointed to a position where he would sort of be the representative to the prairies. What do you think about the way in which Prime Minister Trudeau attempted to address that issue overall?
Well, I thought it was interesting. I read Chantal Hébert wrote earlier today that the other term that could be used for Chrystia Freeland is unity minister. And I thought that was an interesting and probably accurate description of what faces her. For anybody who says, this is just a role in title, hasn't looked at everything that will fall at her feet. I mean, she's still maintaining this U.S.-Canada relationship. She's still working on NAFTA 2.0. And she has the added responsibility of taking all of the skills that she had as Foreign Affairs Minister and bringing them to the domestic stage at a time when we're facing fractures across the country. So her negotiating skills are going to be tested maybe more than ever before, having to negotiate with all of the provinces on some of the most difficult and contentious issues. So I think putting her there sent the signal, A, she's a calm and steady hand in stormy waters. We know her to be a person who is not easily frazzled. She has been sort of a trusted voice for Canadians and dealing with these issues that have been, as I said, really contentious and have really inspired a lot of rhetoric across the country. She'll sort of be that even-keeled stance that we so desperately need. And I think Jim Carr is a very similar type personality. It's putting somebody in place who is very well respected, well educated, somebody who is calm, who is steady, who is trusted. And I think it sends the signal, not only is the West critical and important, but we need individuals in these roles who are prepared to get people back to the table.
Danielle, your thoughts on Minister Freeland?
Well, I think her intergovernmental affairs portfolio is going to keep her really busy in the coming years. Because of all kinds of things, if they want to go ahead, this new government with, decisions on pharmacare, on the pipelines, the way they'll deal with the securalism law in Quebec, that will keep her busy. But obviously, Mr. Trudeau wanted to appoint a diplomat in that position. That's probably what he needs.
Right.
But I believe that she's going to have her hands full. And if there is a crisis, we'll see how she manages these crises, because that's possible in this. It's what comes with this election is possible crises on energy issues, on secularism law in Quebec. So it's going to be interesting to see how she can deal with all these issues, like she dealt with very competently with difficult issues when she was a Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of the time when we're looking, Tim, at the assessment of how she did in her role at Foreign Affairs, we talk about Donald Trump and navigating that relationship and navigating the relationship with his advisors and NAFTA. It'll be different navigating the relationship with Premier Moe, Premier Kenney, Premier Ford, Premier Legault. I mean, those are some very unique and, like Danielle said, her hands will be full.
Yeah, it's a different role for her. Look, I agree with everybody. She's certainly proven herself to be extremely skilled in the international affairs arena. But Frankfurt isn't Fredericton. Let me break that to you. Macron and Merkel are not Moe and Kenney. And Minister Freeland, to the best of my knowledge, Amanda may know better, has not had a lot of experience in the domestic arena. That doesn't mean she can't learn. But look at Joe Clark, and Danielle and Chris will know this particular reference. He was Mulroney's Foreign Affairs Minister, External Affairs Minister for a very long time. After Meech Lake fell apart and Danielle's friends in the Bloc came about, the Reform Party came about, and there was the constitutional crisis of the day. We're not quite there yet. Mulroney brought Joe Clark back in that arena. Now, he may have been destined to fail because of the time and the circumstances, but it's not going to be easy going here for Freeland. She's in a similar sort of circumstance, and the other challenge she may have is that she, and understand the politics of this, is a Liberal MP elected from Toronto University. She represents, to many Conservatives, so a lot of them she's going to have to deal with, the worst of Liberal elitism. So she's going to have to get past that bias. She has the skill set to do it, but it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, that's a point that's important to make, because the way that in which it's being framed by the government at this point is Alberta roots. Like, she's born in Alberta, she has family in Alberta, but she represents a downtown Toronto riding.
And a very elite, like Rosedale downtown riding.
Yeah, and
right?
I'm not saying that that's indicative of her character, who she is, but that is certainly, there is a perception about those ridings in Calgary and rural Alberta, I can tell you for
And let's take a look at the larger perception of the whole cabinet. So 36 new ministers plus the Prime Minister 37, of which 17 come from Ontario and about 10 come from Quebec.
11
so
from
in
Quebec,
total,
17 from Ontario.
Yeah, so in total, it's like 3/4 of the cabinet belong in those two provinces. That's not the same for ridings across the country. So they're clearly, and in terms of economic portfolios, and this is really important, the majority also come from those two provinces. So, that is sending a signal to the West. And it's also sending a signal to their political enemies, right? That the pathway to going back to power is not only Ontario and Quebec, it's not only scooping back those bloc seats, but it's also focused largely on urban areas, right? Urban, right?
And Chris, you had pointed that out to me earlier today. It's a very urban cabinet.
Yeah, even the person who's been in charge of rural economic development comes from Peterborough, Marion Monsef, which may not be a city, but it's not rural.
No,
Look,
it's
you know,
not.
it's a couple of things. Don't underestimate the role that's been handed to Pablo Rodriguez to deal with Quebec, and I know Danielle will have more to say about that. As the Quebec lieutenant, he's certainly going to be dealing with the Bloc Québécois. I assume he will also take somewhat of a leadership role in dealing with François Legault. But if you look at the big tensions in this country, it is clear that this is a country as divided as it has been since the early 1990s, that both the Bloc Québécois and now the Conservatives have very substantial bases outside of Ontario and Quebec. And to go to Kathleen's point, if you look at the ministers and where the strength of those ministries lie, it is primarily with the two provinces that made sure that the Liberals were back in power.
17 of the ministers are from Ontario, 11 from Quebec, 3 from British Columbia, and 1 each from some of the provinces out east. Also a primarily urban cabinet as well. What do you think? Why do you think that is, and what do you think it says?
Well, I think a lot of that is political. I think that when you win an election based on those members and their hard work in those provinces and where those provinces swung, and you have a caucus that's made up primarily from those provinces, that's where you're going to choose from. You're also keeping a lot of your cabinet from last time around. So there weren't a lot of changes in terms of who's in cabinet. There were switches of portfolios, and there are some new faces, but not that many new faces, with representation from the East and, of course, representation from the West. So I wouldn't read into it that much, except to say that I think there's a big shining light on Quebec. And importantly, as we look at the fractures across the country and we try to marry and find common ground between the East and the West, it's going to be critical that we have ministers in place that can bring people back to the table, that can find a collaborative approach. And that's why you see some of the appointments in Quebec, and it's certainly why you see Pablo Rodriguez taking the role that he took.
Yeah, let's pick up on that with Danielle. Pablo Rodriguez will not only be the House leader, he'll also act as the government's lieutenant in Quebec. What do you think of that appointment, and what kind of ground do you think there is to gain, if at all, for the Liberals in Quebec right now?
Well, just before commenting on it, generally, Mr. Trudeau had no choice. He had most of his MPs elected in Quebec and Ontario and some in BC. So he had to choose those people that were elected, and they were elected mainly in urban areas in those three provinces. Quebec has a strong component of that cabinet, 10 or 11 out of 37, including the Prime Minister. And Rodriguez is someone that might be able to deal with Quebec issues, but it's not easy, and he won't have an easy time with Legault and with Sonia Lebel, and on this issue of secularism, he's been on record suggesting that he might, think it's a good idea to go and challenge the Quebec law, and Parliament will be a difficult Parliament to deal with, even though people say, well, the Bloc doesn't have a real balance of power, the NDP doesn't have a balance of power, but there are always great surprises during a legislature. And I think, although some people think it will last longer than other or previous minority governments, I'm not sure that's going to happen. It might last in a year and a half, too, but then we'll go to elections because some people will want to try to become the future majority government.
When you look at the makeup of cabinet, Tim, what sticks out for you?
Well, the numbers. I guess you have a case of you need more ministers to deal with less MPs, right? This is his biggest cabinet, 36 people. What that is all about is caucus management. One of the knocks about Justin Trudeau was he wasn't too attuned to his caucus when he had the majority. I think he's put more people in there or kept people in there because he wants to send a signal that he's listening, he's paying attention, and he's rewarding them. He needs his own caucus to stay in line if his leadership ever gets challenged. And the other thing, I have to have this mini rant. Question was asked. Get ready. It's not about the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity. I'll spare the projectile vomit. It's about the question that came about whether or not Seamus O'Regan, being from Newfoundland and Labrador, was able to serve the people of the West. I mean, how asinine and dumb is that, given that Newfoundland and Labrador is a resource-producing province? I think that's in part why he's picked. They have the same challenges challenges as those provinces. And if you've ever sat on a plane between Alberta and anywhere else in Canada, but particularly Newfoundland, you'll see tons of Newfoundlanders going out there. You can go after O'Regan for his record, that's fair game, but this sense that because he's from Newfoundland, somehow he can't properly represent or understand the interests of the West, stupid.
Okay, I feel like you have a personal investment in that, given your home province. I'm going to play devil's advocate on behalf of my colleague, though, and a second say, having also, you know Newfoundland better than I do, but I did work in Alberta, and the oil and gas industry in those two provinces is not completely parallel. They aren't exactly the same. You're absolutely right that Newfoundlanders are often working in the oil patch. There's a ton of people on the plane going back and forth. But maybe the genesis, I understand your scrutiny on the phrasing of the question, but the genesis of it could perhaps be that his understanding of the industry as it is in his province is not directly applicable to the way the industry works in Alberta.
All of the provinces, all three of the provinces, economic success is dependent upon oil production. That's pretty much in line. And have you been to Fort McMurray? It's 90% Newfoundlander.
Many times for weeks
I
at
know
a time.
you have.
Yeah.
The only thing I would jump in on that particular topic is the challenge that faces currently Alberta and Saskatchewan is that they are landlocked. Tim, you know, Newfoundland, Labrador, not landlocked, water access right there. So the major challenge that those two provinces in the prairies face, and the challenge that they face with their industry in terms of getting resources to market, is not faced by Newfoundlanders. So I think that is a key point you have to acknowledge. What I take away from the cabinet today announcement, I mean, I do think the economic ministries are interesting in how they've kind of been parceled out. How Jolie now has this major economic role, and so that will be interesting to watch, even though she still reports under Baines. I do have to flag that I have some major concerns about the new Minister of Labour, only because Philomena, while coming from Labour Town, from Steel Town, from Hamilton, she knows that crowd well. We are in the middle of a pretty major strike right now, a Teamster strike with CN Rail, and we worry that without the full backing and understanding of the labour movement, that the Liberals will go back to their default position of implementing back to work legislation.
Why do you think that's their default?
Well, because it's been, sadly, time and time again, they do that,
I think Minister Garneau was asked, if I recall from the emails that we've been getting, was asked about it today, and he said he really wants both sides. They're still...
so encouraging conversation. There's a lot of economics.
They haven't taken that.
The one thing we haven't discussed, though, is I think the timeline, just to pick on what Daniel Turp said, the timeline for measurable success or progress is very short for this government. We all put it into 100 days, but the lasting impression you get of minority governments is they run about 18 months to 2 years. So you need to put some things in the window, and you need to be able to get them passed. And to come back to the various ministers who are in economic portfolios, Jonathan Wilkinson off the top of the show, can you make some progress on shifting towards a green technology in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan? Can you come up with an agreement with the two provinces that seem to be malleable, that being Manitoba and New Brunswick, to bring in some kind of price on carbon? They need to show that they can govern quickly. Otherwise, it could be a very difficult period.
Looking towards the next few days, few months, maybe few years. We'll see how it goes.
Definitely a few years.
Okay, well, you might be a little bit biased in that assessment, but okay, I'll take it. What are you watching for, especially as we head into now Parliament convening on December 5th, a throne speech, and actually some, introduction perhaps of legislation? What will you be watching for?
So a couple of things, but before I say that, I just wanted to mention one other thing that I thought was really interesting about today. If you go back to 2015 and you think about what we were all talking about right off the top of every show in 2015, the front of every paper, all the headlines, the gender balanced cabinet. And now you fast forward 4 years, it's we're barely mentioning it. We're not mentioning it not because it's not important, but because it's not a novelty anymore. It's sort of an expectation. And I watched that today and I thought it was this sort of feeling like progress is actually being made on that front because it is a gender balanced cabinet. And I thought that was kind of important to mention. As we move forward, I mean, listen, these early days are going to matter so much. I think that the tone that's being set, not just by some of these appointments, but by how they communicate to the country in those first few days and weeks as we head into the holiday will matter a lot, because it's going to set the stage for how 2020 kicks off, how how Parliament kicks off, how we're looking at some of these major issues that this government wants to address, from climate change to middle class prosperity to gun safety to pharmacare, some of these signature platform topics that became hallmarks of the election, but they need to be able to move on. And of course, nothing will matter more than how they're able to talk about unity in the country. And hopefully some of these appointments today are going to be signaling to different areas, different corners of the country, that this government is serious about getting that right.
I guess beyond the appointments, though, and beyond whatever they say, Tim, I'm wondering what you think tangibly we'll be seeing. We know, for example, the Prime Minister has said that middle-class tax cut that he promised during the campaign will be the first order of business. Beyond that, what might there be?
Yeah, well, I think we're going to go into a big period of brokerage now. I think the Prime Minister has bought himself some peace, maybe with the federal Parliament and the public until the budget. So what happens between now and the budget? What are going to be the trade-off items that get into that budget? The throne speech is going to pass. And do we see any signals sent soon? So just use one example. Jonathan Wilkinson, the new Environment Minister, generally did pretty well in fisheries, respected across party lines. A lot of credibility is being invested in him because of his Saskatchewan roots. Any signals or signs coming from there that things like C-69 or the pace of the Trans Mountain are about to change? I'll be watching for that. That's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I asked him if he was open to amending C-69 or C-48, and he didn't say never, but he then basically hinted that he supported the legislation, but thought that through the implementation, for example, of C-69, which means regulations, there could be some changes. It'll be interesting to see how that translates. Danielle, what are you looking for as we head into the throne speech and other events?
Well, I tend to agree with the idea that environment, climate change, and pipelines will be a major issue in this next legislature. And don't forget, in a few days only, people will be looking at what's happening in Madrid, at the COP25, and then what will be the position of the new government. And just to talk about the cabinet, there was a lot of disappointment yesterday that Stephen Guilbeault wasn't appointed the Minister of Environment, because that's why he's in politics and that's what he wants to do, but he wasn't. And I think understandably so, because, he wouldn't be very welcome in the West when it comes to the Environment Minister. So I think that's going to be a big issue, and it should be. Environment should be a great concern of all and of this Parliament, of the government. And it disappointed a lot of people in the whole country from east to west, because you don't know really where the government stands on these climate change issues, and it will have to have a very clear stand, because it will not get the respect of those voters that they want to get back for at the next election.
Chris, it's funny because I had asked Minister Wilkinson about Stephen Guilbeault and why he wasn't in that position, because I heard in the press conference with the Prime Minister, basically every single reporter from Quebec, that was their question. So it was significant to them that he was not put in that position. I think if you live in other parts of the country, it's easy to see why, as Danielle points out, that would have been sent a very different signal.
And interesting, it was the first name that was leaked by somebody to reporters in Quebec, particularly that Stephen Guilbeault was going to be the Heritage Minister. Look, I know we're all talking about cabinet and priorities for the government. I would also flag this. Tim raised it just briefly. How well does the caucus get managed? I mean, we have a real issue here. People who are now long-term MPs who aren't getting in, people who are going to be expected to toe the line, but now who have real authority, real power to be able to say, look, we want this done differently, or we want whatever issue they want to put forward, because you can't count on people necessarily supporting you when they have a bit of leverage. So I'll be interested in caucus management, to what extent people are frustrated and unhappy with what they've seen out of today's cabinet choices and what they see as the priorities of the government.
Kathleen, what do you think?
I think that.
Oh, sorry, Danielle, go ahead, and then I'll get Kathleen in.
I would add cabinet management, because Justin Trudeau was not very good at managing his previous cabinet. And, when two important ministers have to leave or he sends them away, that is not something that proves that he can manage cabinet well. And that's going to be a crucial issue, especially there's 37 of them now.
When we see, when the House comes back and we see those regional caucuses getting developed and who the regional leads are, that's another way to kind of make peace with some of the caucus members, to give them roles there and certainly give them different assignments and political assignments. Because I think policy-wise, I don't see any indication from the Liberals so far that any of their policy priorities or the lenses that they put on their policies, like they have since 2015, the lens of gender, the lens of the environment and climate, the lens of Indigenous issues. I don't see those changing. What I do see is a stronger political top note that they're putting on all of the work that they do.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean that they'll be having people like Pablo Rodriguez in the House as House Leader, and that was a very wise choice from my opinion, because not only is he an experienced political operator, but he knows what weapons to bring to the fight, and he also will know how to work with the bloc to basically get some deals done. Frankly, it was under the Harper government, I've mentioned this before on the show, the Harper managed through his minorities by consistently getting the bloc to pass their budgets in 06 and 07. And so that kind of relationship that I think that Pablo will be strong at doing will be an important one in the House.
Amanda, I saw you nodding.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I also think when it comes to caucus and how you manage maybe some of the bruised egos, those individuals who felt perhaps that they should have been brought into cabinet, you know, there's other ways to give them important roles. Some of those regional roles will really matter. Some of the committee roles will really matter. The parliamentary secretary roles obviously will matter. So I heard a lot of names.
Matter enough to help with those bruised egos?
I think certainly especially for the rookie MPs, yes, those will matter a lot. And even if they played a big role in the election, that's a nice way to kind of like skate your way in. It's where Seamus O'Regan started, it's where Mary Ng started. So you see how that can be obviously the stepping stone to a cabinet position. So that may be enough. For those who have been waiting in the wings for some time, like a name like Adam Vaughan comes to mind, I don't know. I don't know if that'll be enough. And that certainly will require some management, both by the Prime Minister and I think other members of cabinet to keep caucus happy.
Tim, I've got a minute left. You're the last word.
Well, I'll try and make it. I'll probably try and make it useful. Oh, Chris, sorry, we already lost 20 seconds there. I would say this one interesting thing about Adam Vaughan not being in cabinet: the sport portfolio isn't there. That's going to cause some frustration in the sport community.
I think you're thinking of Adam Van Couverden.
Adam Van Couverden,
yes,
sorry, yes,
yeah.
Adam Van
Unseated
Couverden.
Lisa Raitt in Milton. Yeah.
But again, sport now is under heritage, right?
Yes.
It's
So
always been
may
under
very
heritage,
well
though.
Back under
It's always been under heritage.
under heritage. No. There was Ministry of Science
Amanda,
and Sport.
Trust me, I know
led
about
by
this one as
Kirsty
somebody who leads
Duncan.
a sports organization. The sport community's not going to be happy, but I'll end with this, Vashi. I have this terrible image of Guilbeault and O'Regan being like Thelma and Louise now, driving across Alberta and Saskatchewan. Thank you, Danielle, for that. Thank you for that.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, everyone. Thanks. I don't even know what that meant, but okay.
Where it came from.
Thanks to our power panel this evening. Really appreciate it. Danielle Turp, Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, Kathleen Monk, and Chris Hall. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.